Andrew Hoffman, Faith Steinberg, Lee Williams, and then Max Weiss.
My name is Andrew Hoffman. I am the Vice Chairman of the Community Housing Improvement Program, a board member of the Rent Stabilization Association, and an owner-operator of rent-stabilized housing in New York City. In this hostile city where the everyday life of doing business is impossible, the Rent Guidelines Board must transcend politics and set guidelines that reflect the increased cost of operating rental housing in New York City. The board's mandate, according to Rent Stabilization Law 26-512, is to review the residential real estate market in New York City, including such factors as the prevailing and projected real estate taxes, sewer rates, gross operating maintenance costs, including insurance, governmental fees, cost of fuel, and labor. This year, the core PIOC raised by 3.6%. Our real estate taxes increased by 4.21%. Last year was 5%. Utilities increased by 6%. Last year was 8.4%. And insurance is up 7% this year. Yes, fuel has declined, but the PIOC shows that the cost of natural gas heating buildings increased by 1.7%, and due to regulations enacted 3 years ago to outlaw 6 fuel, many of us were required to switch to natural gas, and we're not seeing the sharp declines that the PIOC is showing. Also, with natural gas, many of us have entered into long-term price contracts in order to hedge that price, and we did not see the massive decreases other people saw. We all know, I'll wrap up, we all know the mayor made an irresponsible promise the past 2 years that he'd get 0. He should have never made this promise. The board is supposed to be fair and impartial. We've all been listening to the governor and the mayor speak about affordable housing in New York. A rent rollback, a rent freeze, is not the way to create affordable housing. We've all seen owners need subsidies and incentives, not a path to disinvestment to increase the stabilized housing stock. The last time prices were frozen was 1942, and that was in World War II, when everything was frozen. Go back. I liked your idea about real estate taxes before. Go back, figure out how to freeze all our expenses, and we'll be very happy to take a 0. But this year we need 5 for a 1 year and 9% for a 2 year. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No questions, thank you. Ms. Steinberg, Faith Steinberg? You are consistent with where the tenant numbers are, I promise. We've had several public officials, so I think it feels a little skewed. Thank you. But I promise we won't forget you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Housing is a basic necessity of life. It's part of the Declaration of Human Rights. But the landlords are greedy, and there are rare exceptions, but they'll bleed people dry. I've been living in my apartment for 42 years. Fortunately, I saved my check and beginning lease plus an old bank statement where my deposit was held, which I sent her copies of. That was because she wanted a new security lease, and she ignored what I sent her. But anyway, landlords want only to collect rents and put nothing back into the buildings. I'm on SCREE, and when I requested repairs, I had to issue her a summons, and when she received it, she threw in my face that the deduction she gets from SCREE when she pays taxes, it was around $5,000. It meant nothing compared to the amount of taxes she had to pay. This is an inadvertent admission that her LLCs are doing very well, as I'm sure the majority of landlords are. If they're having a hard time, they have an option of claiming hardship. but they have to open their books. I have to show my income when I apply for SCREE. So can the owners of buildings. All these years, when landlords have been crying poor and oh, the expenses, I go out shopping and I see the cost of living go up and up, as all tenants do. Our incomes do not match the increase in expenses, and like the landlords, we do not get a tax deduction for it. And that's why we need a rollback to compensate for the hardships perpetrated on tenants over the years. Roll back the rents.
Thank you, Ms. Steinberg. So we'll hear, thank you, Ms. Steinberg. Thank you so much for your testimony. We'll hear next from Lee Williams, then Max Weiss, who's the for Assemblywoman Linda Rosenthal, then Carolyn Meckler. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and the rest of the committee for hearing my testimony today. I'm a real estate agent in Manhattan. I work with rent-regulated tenants and market-rate tenants. I also do sales, rentals, and investments. Many people agree in this room that there is a shortage of affordable housing in the city, and I think that we can all agree that there's no clear solution to it. There's been mention of having a grander conversation from the board and from some of the previous people here who have testified. In some of the reports that I've read, net operating income appears to be up for small landlords. That's nice, but it doesn't tell the entire picture for the small landlord. Many of them have been squeezed, as we've just heard, by increased utility expenses, labor expenses, and the like. Right now, Miller Samuel says that as of April 15th, there was a 1.75% vacancy rate in the city. There are no apartments available. Being on the ground, I can tell you this, and I can also tell you that most small landlords want to provide safe, affordable housing for their tenants. It's good for them as a business, it's good for the communities, and it's also good for the tenants. My issue is that the net operating income is not the sole and perfect measure of what we need to look at, because in some instances, in most instances, it doesn't take into account the debt service. Landlords may have mortgages. It's difficult for them, if not impossible, to pay them off without an early penalty. And that penalty can be substantial. However, they have not benefited from some of the lower interest rates. While they have benefited from the fuel decrease, many of them, as you've just heard, have not reaped the rewards that were promised from the price of natural gas that has come down. I'd also be remiss if I did not mention taxes. They have gone up and up and up. HPD expenses have also gone up, and the fines are somewhat difficult to clear. I work with a couple of investors, and my advice to them when they ask me should they buy a building, I tell them no. I tell them buy single family, buy condominiums, or buy 1 to 4 family unit buildings that exempt you from all of this regulation. You'll see a higher return on your investment. They're coming to me for professional advice. Do I work with large landlords? Yes. Do I work with small landlords? Yes. Do I want to see these turned into co-ops and condos? Absolutely not. I'd rather work with an apartment building owner, and rent that apartment several times rather than sell it once. It's better for my industry, it's better for me, and I think it's better for the tenants. We do need an increase, and we need something that is going to cover a reasonable operating expense increase.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I think there are no questions. Thank you. So Max Weiss, then Council Member Ben Kalos, Carolyn Meckler, then Larry Wood.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Max Weiss. I work for Assembly Member Linda Rosenthal, who represents the Upper West Side, parts of Clinton Hill, parts of Clinton, Hell's Kitchen, and she would be here today, but she's in Albany. As a member of the Housing Committee, she is a passionate advocate for tenants' rights and affordable housing. And today, I'd like to echo her call to urge the RGB to forgo imposing any increases this year and to roll back the rents on rent-stabilized tenants. the increases under consideration by the RGB could further enrich landlords and corporations at the expense of New York's middle class. Year after year, we've seen landlords' profits skyrocket even as their tenants are twisting themselves in knots, scrambling to pay all their bills. Given the economics and affordability of rent, it would be preposterous for the RGB to once again place the burden of a changing economy which had an equal, if not greater, impact on tenants squarely on their backs. With the rent law set to expire in a few weeks, now must be the year of the tenant. Maintaining the status quo is simply unacceptable, and the RGB must remember its mission as an objective, independent arbiter of rent increases for rent-stabilized tenants. Anything short of a rent rollback would be a slap in the face to tenants across the city who have for years fallen victim to the RGB's pro-landlord ideology. To repair the damage of so many exorbitant rent increases and the loss of thousands of affordable units, the Assembly member is calling on you to do only the reasonable thing and enact a rent rollback this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weiss. Councilman Benkelis.
Good afternoon to the Rent Guidelines Board and to all the tenants we have here today. I'm Council Member Ben Kalos. I represent the Upper East Side, Midtown East, Roosevelt Island, and El Barrio. To New Yorkers here today, and especially tenants, thank you for attending this hearing. I'm proud to stand with you today. This year I'm calling for the Rent Guidelines Board to vote for a rent rollback. If you agree, you can tweet me at Ben Kalos. Please also use the hashtag rent rollback. Again, tweet at Ben Kalos, hashtag rent rollback. Last year, the board voted for a historic low 1% increase for one-year leases and 2.75% for two-year leases, but that did not correct for the disproportionately high increase of previous years. Year after year, as rent goes up, tenants have shouldered an undue burden. Meanwhile, income cannot keep pace and only crept up by 2.3% between 2005 and 2013 in real terms. The approved rent increases each year have largely been based upon the landlord's operating cost measured by the price index of operating cost, the PIOC. This practice not only fails to consider tenants, but is also proven to be inaccurate. Based upon data from the Department of Finance, the PIOC has overstated landlord costs by 11% since 2005. This miscalculation led to unfairly high rent increases in past years, which must be corrected with a rent rollback. Those increases have come with consequences. A unit is considered affordable if the rent is no higher than 30% of the household income. The median rent to income ratio of tenants in rent-stabilized apartments is 36.4%. By this standard, a majority of rent-stabilized tenants have units that are not affordable. The stress of financial insecurity takes a toll on New Yorkers every day. To correct this, I'm urging a rent rollback. I represent 29,000 rent-stabilized tenants in my district and across the city. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your testimony here today. So, can you tell us what the average market rate rents are in your district now?
I actually can't afford to live in my district based on average market rates. If I wanted to get a one-bedroom in the building that I'm in, I believe they're going for $4,000 or $5,000 a month. So without these stabilizations, nobody can afford to live in this city.
So what do your constituents face who are still in rent-stabilized apartments? What kind of an experience do they have living in their apartment? You know, average stabilized rent's $1,000. What's their experience with those pressures, that the landlord's putting on them to try to get that unit into market?
One of the top requests we have in my office is people come in and say, we want to stay in our rent-regulated unit, or we want to find a rent-regulated unit. For those who are in the rent-regulated units, we're often dealing with landlords that are doing everything they can to get them out, or at least that's the conclusion I draw from the fact that they're not getting services. Additionally, landlords are using things like major capital improvements. So your sink may not work, your bathroom may not work, the hot water may not work, the heat may come off in the winter, but you got new windows, and now your rent's going to go up. So those are some of the big things that we're seeing in the district. And there's not enough affordable housing in this city, and we can't just pave over all the rent-regulated buildings and replace them with billionaire buildings on 52nd Street.
Councilman, as you know, this board has to rely on data, and we do our absolute best, and staff does an amazing amount of work to ensure that the data we rely upon is as accurate as possible. So I assume that you're aware, but I just want to make sure, and I also would like the audience to know that the board has recalibrated the price index of operating costs this year to more accurately reflect costs. And again, I want to make sure you're aware of that and that the audience is aware of that, so that you know we do take this seriously and we are attempting to have as accurate a reflection of costs as is possible in light of the data that is available.
Thank you for recalibrating the PIOC, and also for finding that the operating costs have only gone up 0.5% this year, which is why we're hoping that you can outdo your previous historic lows, and not only that, but make up for some of the previous PIOCs by rolling things back, because it's only 0.5%, so if we roll back, we can actually catch tenants up with some of the increases based on a previously less accurate PIOC.
Thank you for your testimony.
Ben, please stay right there. Hi. You remember me from last year.
I absolutely do. How are you?
Sometimes I always feel like this is a Vote Ben kind of presentation, but again, as I was last year, and again I'm going to be this year, I'm very critical of making broad, sweeping generalizations and assumptions, particularly in the situation that you're in. You have a voice, you have a very powerful voice, you're an elected official, and I just feel like it's irresponsible when you make broad statements that are not necessarily backed by data that's been provided to us as the Rent Guidelines Board. It's plain and simple for me.
So I think I already touched on this, but I will admit I'm here in my own self-interest. I want to be able to afford to live in my district, and I want other people to be able to afford to live here. I've also been making sure to look at the data, and in terms of tying it to the CPI and looking at the costs overall, and then also just looking at your own new calculation for the PIOC of that 0.5%, which is great. And I think this is the year that we can finally do that rollback. So I think anything we can do to just preserve our rent-regulated housing and keep it from getting vacancy decontrolled, and just keep the costs low for our tenants, because they're not getting any richer, but the costs are going up for them, and we need to be a city where everyone can live.
There's a big session going on right now in Albany. I almost wonder if that would have been a really good use of your time today too. They're trying to figure this out.
Albany advocating too. We are asking Albany to. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you. So, if we could hear.
I just want to, I really appreciate that we also go to Albany. I'm wondering, what your position is on repealing vacancy decontrol and ensuring that tenants remain in your district. As you know, probably in Manhattan alone, in rent-stabilized buildings, less than 40% of those units in those buildings seem to be rent-stabilized now. So in your district, in your borough, how do you respond to the issue of the loss of rent stabilization in such a rapid pace in the last few years?
This city has lost 104,155 rent-stabilized units in the past 20 years, and that's a problem. So I was proud to join the mayor, the Congress, senators, and assembly members on Saturday at a rally in Harlem calling to repeal vacancy decontrol, calling to repeal and fix the MCIs, calling for an improvement to the 421A program, and a laundry list of other items, including the Erstat law, so that we can finally have a say in how we run our city. Thank you.
So I understand Councilmember Mark. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I understand Councilmember Mark Levine is present.
Hello, Ms. Chair. Can we begin?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Hello, everybody. So happy to have this chance to speak very briefly on this critical issue. I'm Mark Levine, council member. Thank you. Council member for the 7th District in Northern Manhattan, which includes parts of the Upper West Side, Manhattan Valley, Morningside Heights, West Harlem, Hamilton Heights, Washington Heights. Community's home to tens of thousands of rent-regulated apartments. It's one of the highest numbers of any council district in the city. So the decisions that you all are making as a group will have a profound impact on the families in my community. And it's why I'm here today to call for a rent rollback. For years, this board has been over-accounting for the costs of landlords and has not been taking into account the economic circumstances of tenants. And the result has been, in fact, dire for tenants, where today, over 36%, a median of 36%, the median rent burden for tenants in rent-stabilized apartments is 36%, well above the level at which is considered sustainable and affordable. So even in rent-stabilized apartments, these are not market rate apartments, tenants are feeling the pain of higher rents. And this at a time since the last financial crisis, when wages have stagnated, when many sectors have seen falling wages, tenants are hurting. And in the face of that, year after year after year, you have raised rents on a flawed accounting for the cost of landlords. And I'm here to urge that you not do it again. Especially this year, absolutely, when the most important and largest component of any landlord's cost, which is fuel, oil, and gas, those prices are down dramatically, 21%. And you must take that into account when setting your rent increase. I fear that further increases will only make it easier for landlords to haul tenants into housing court, where they know the deck is stacked against tenants because so few have attorneys and virtually every landlord does. By keeping rents affordable, by rolling them back, you will level the playing field for millions of New York City men, women, and children who have been facing pain in housing for far too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I wanted to ask you a little bit, to expand a little bit about the rates in housing court and where are people coming from when they are evicted in housing court. And, you know, the staggering numbers of 60,000 people sleeping in homeless shelters, and what our decision and how it can impact that number.
Thank you, Ms. Garcia. We have an epidemic of evictions in New York City, 25,000 last year alone. That number's up over the years. And it is feeding homelessness in this city. The single largest source of homelessness, largest cause of homelessness, is eviction. And a majority of evictions occur in rent-regulated apartments. That's no surprise. Landlords want to get tenants out so they can jack up the rent to market rate. And that's relevant to this group because every % you increase the rents makes it that much easier for landlords to secure an eviction in housing court, where they know the deck is stacked against tenants, where they know most tenants will not have attorneys. We've got to address all these problems. We've got to roll back rents. We've got to get attorneys for tenants in housing court. We've got to end vacancy decontrol. And yes, I was in Albany last week talking to leaders of both parties in both chambers, making this exact point. And what they're doing in Albany is critically important. But there's a huge, huge, huge responsibility in your hands to alleviate the pain for tenants in New York City.
Thank you, Councilman.
Councilmember, we heard from RSA earlier today that the middle class is doing fine in New York City and they can afford an increase. And they also said that there's tens of thousands of millionaires living in rent-stabilized apartments. I'm wondering how you respond to claims and allegations based on what you see in your district and what you see around the city.
Well, I'm not sure how RSA defines middle class, but this is a city where someone making $40,000 a year can barely survive when you look at the rent burden and other costs. This is a city where even people with good middle class jobs, teachers and firefighters, are leaving. They're leaving the city. They simply cannot afford to live here anymore. And as for this canard that rent-stabilized housing is full of millionaires, there are almost 1 million families in rent-stabilized units. And it's possible that amongst that million, there are some people who are doing well, but the vast, vast majority of tenants in stabilized housing are struggling to make it. They are barely able to make their monthly rent payment, and the statistics prove this. So many are rent burdened by any reasonable definition, and to obscure that reality by cherry picking a few stories is simply dishonest.
Thank you, Councilmember. No further questions.
Thank you for your time and your attention. Thank you.
So Carolyn Meckler, then Larry Wood, Bonnie Diaz, and Ingrid McAteer. Ms. Meckler? And if everyone would like to leave their testimony to our amazing transcriber, it will be easier for him to make sure we have a complete accounting of everything that was said. So thank you so much.
I apologize, I've never spoken here before, so I just want to read the transcript.
Sure.
All I did was apologize for not bringing a piece of paper for transcription. I am a landlord on the Upper West Side. I have a 5-unit building now. It used to be a 10-unit building. It's been reduced. And I am very happy to have my SCREE tenant who only pays $600 a month and hasn't seen an increase, but he shouldn't because he's SCREE. And his rent, even with the subsidy, doesn't cover his portion by a square footage of taxes, insurance, and heat. I don't know what anyone sees, but I've owned my building 15 years, and I have never once made a profit. But I live in the building, I care for a beautiful building. You don't care about my circumstances. I understand that. Not one of these people in this room cares. I made my choice when I bought the building, and that's fine. But I do want to give the handyman and the porters who only help periodically in my building, because I do 90% of the work myself, a fair increase in wages. Every time you freeze or only give me a 1% increase, I give them 0 because my taxes went up, my water bill went up, and my insurance went up. So they got nothing. We want in this city a fair living wage for people. And so all these services, that's how I keep my stuff afloat. That's how I don't go bankrupt. So I really think that if you want to preserve any type of affordable housing in the city where the small landlord keeps, then you need to give us a raise. Because otherwise, at the end, when my kids graduate high school in 3 years, I will be selling my building to someone who's going to buy out my SCREE tenant and convert it to a single-family house, so that my $4 million building will now be a $13 million building, and someone else will make it, and now there will be not only no SCREE person, but there will be no semi-affordable housing that I provide for my non-stabilized tenants. Thank you very much.
I just have a quick question. You said it's a 5-unit building?
Yes.
And so that one person, is that person rent controlled or rent stabilized?
He's rent stabilized. He's been there for 45 years.
Because if it has to be 6 units or more.
It was through the years, because at one time it was a 10-unit building.
Oh, it was a 10-unit building, and you've contracted to...
I contracted it a little bit, but then the previous owners, this has been an owner-occupied building for 3 generations, but not the same families.
And the other 4 units are then market rate units?
The other 3. I live in one.
You live in one.
I live in one.
And the other 3
are now. But I have not been able, because of the stagnation in income, to be able to get a increase more than about 0.5% to 1% from my market rate tenants for the last 2 years.
Because they're paying market.
They've been paying market rate. I actually had to take a hit when the market declined. So at one point my rents were higher, and then they've come up very, very slowly through the years.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Thank you, Ms. Meckler. Thank you, Ms. Meckler. Larry Wood, then Bonnie Diaz, Ingrid McAteer, then Lisa Bradshaw. If you could just leave them, could you? We'll come get them. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Wood.
You're welcome. Like I do every year for the last 20-odd years I've been down here, I want to thank each member of the Rent Guidelines Board for their service. I know the tenant reps are loved by their community, and I hope the landlord reps are beloved by their community. I know the 5 public members, you really have a really tough job trying to balance things. You're hated by both sides. And I know you do.
Thanks, Larry.
And I know you work hard. People who say the fix is in or it's predetermined, that you're a rubber stamp, they're not right. I understand you guys work very hard trying to look at the data, trying to make a fair determination, and it's very difficult. You have to do a one-size-fits-all rent increase, except in certain circumstances when you can look at provisos and try to tailor the guideline increase accordingly. And I actually just wanted to say I was in Albany the other day. I also got arrested in Albany with 55 other people in Albany the other day. We were trying to send a strong message to the governor, and apparently he's heard because he's changed his position as to his position initially was a straight renewal of the rent laws, and he's come around to see we have to do a lot more to preserve the units we have out there, and he's now on record supporting repeal of vacancy decontrol. So I reach here on behalf of single-room occupancy, hotel and rooming house tenants, and there's so few of us left out there. I really hope you'll listen to the SRO tenants that come out and testify. You're going to have to pick them out among the many other tenants and landlords who do come before you today. I've talked at length at the invited panel and to some of you individually, giving you the history of SROs. There's such a small fraction of the rent-stabilized stock that's out there, less than 5%, but there's still a very critical component of the housing out there.
You passed a whole bunch of stuff. Do you want to highlight some of the stuff that you passed out?
Well, I want to highlight just a memo. Andrew produced a memo for the Rent Guidelines Board. It's dated May 22nd, 2015, and I just wanted to highlight some of the findings of that memo. I've done that in the chart that I've given you. It's a legal-sized piece of paper. There's very little data out there on SROs. In the past, the Housing and Vacancy Survey, from that survey, we were able to look at some of the demographics in SROs, the mean and median rents, the demographics of the people who live in them. So the chart that I've given you has the last time that was done in '96 and 2002. And if you looked at the chart, you see the number of units occupied, the demographics, the income, and you can see the income to the rent-to-income ratio is really quite high, even higher than what's been referenced for apartment tenants repeatedly. The remaining SRO tenants have extremely high rent burdens. Literally, a rent increase can be enough to put them over the top and potentially make them homeless.
Mr. Wood, I assure you we will look carefully at all these documents. I very want to make sure that other people have a chance to testify.
I'll keep it real sharp. I'll keep it tight. I just want to point out the data that Andrew was able to get from DHCR shows that despite the past 3 years there being a rent freeze for SROs, the mean and median rents have gone up once again for SROs. It's now the mean rent of over $1,200 for an SRO unit, a median rent of over $1,100. These are obscenely high rent burdens. Also, the number of exempt units has continued to go up. In 2005, we were at a little over a quarter. Now we're up at 37.6%. What we mean by exempt, these are units that are not being rented out to rent-stabilized tenants, but instead being rented out to college students, to tourists, or to city placements. These are really extraordinary sources of income for many of these buildings, and these SROs are very profitable, very valuable property.
Thank you, Mr. Wood.
So in that regard, they do not warrant a rent increase.
Thank you for your testimony. Bonnie?
Yeah, I'm just wondering about this other handout, why are you giving us information on this family that's vacant?
Well, this particular one, I think, just illustrates the case I was making about how profitable these buildings have become. This is a rooming house on West 75th Street, 140 West 75th. I took this down from the internet. The landlord is actually guaranteeing that it can be delivered vacant. He's got, if you look at the back, the C of O for this building, it was converted in 1920 to 9 studios and 8 B units. Those are units with shared bathrooms and kitchens. They were considered a bachelor apartments. This building, they're trying to get $12.5 million for. The current rent roll is $374,000, while the estimated expenses is $103,000. So the net operating income is $270,000. To make twice as much money in this building than the operating expenses. It's extraordinarily profitable building, but they're advertising it to be delivered vacant and turn it back into a single-family mansion. Just showing you how valuable these buildings have become.
Thank you so much for the information.
Please, a rent freeze once again for SRO tenants. Thank you.
So Bonnie Diaz, Ingrid McAteer, Lisa Bradshaw, and James Jones.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Bonnie Diaz, and I am a property manager for a 15-unit building in Chelsea. 10 stabilized and 5 not. Quick history of the building. Single gentleman, older gentleman, owned it for many, many years. Kept everybody on a very low preferential rent, everybody in the building. He was sick about 3 years ago. The last year of his illness, for some reason, 3 or 4 of the tenants, very low preferential, decided to stop paying rent. I don't know why. By the time the smoke cleared, we got working with everybody to try to get the building up and running. It was kind of like the inmates were running the asylum. It took us 1 or 2 years to get through the legal jargon to get everybody back on track. But the biggest thing that affected us was the legal fees, with the people not paying the rent, paying preferential rent, very extreme amounts of legal fees to try to get the building back up to code or running or wherever we were working with. The biggest thing we dealt with, unfortunately, was 3 or 4, actually 5 people that had preferential rent were running a very successful Airbnb business. I had 1 living in Florida, 1 living in California. I had 2 living around the building, around the corner in high-rise condos, and 1 was living in the building, but he'd come back and forth. Very savvy way they worked was that they were smart enough to be seen walking in and out of the building. It was their mailing address. Very difficult to catch them. It took us over 1.5 years to track them. They finally started posting their stuff on Airbnb, how wonderful, what wonderful hosts they were, all that good stuff. So after about 2.5 years of extreme legal bills, we did get 2 of the apartments back. 1 girl came back in at the last second. I believe she got kicked out of our condo around the corner. And I just wanted to add one thing about harassment. Tenants harass property managers and landlords as well. The 1 gal that came back into the building after being caught for the Airbnb has been nonstop harassment to our office. 24-hour phone calls, threatening messages, and it goes both ways. So even though we do appreciate that we want to try to work with tenants and we do understand both sides, being a small property person, a rent freeze with the small preferential rents, these people were making anywhere from $2,000 to $2,500 a week profiteering. So what can we say? Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story. Ms. McAteer? Then Lisa Bradshaw, James Jones, and Reno Piantasa. Thank you for your patience, Ms. McAteer.
I live around the corner on Park Avenue and 36th Street. At the turn of the century, there were 148 rent-regulated apartments in my building. Today, there are fewer than 24. Every single one went directly to market rate. This, of course, is in addition to numerous MCI increases and 60% RGB increases since the turn of the century on 1-year leases. Looking only at my floor, the apartment next door to me was $2,500 at the turn of the century. Today it is $6,700. The apartment next door went from $750 directly to $3,100 a month. Check my math. My landlord would have had to spend $70,000 renovating a 2.5-room apartment. The apartment next door is rent regulated. The tenant got an eviction notice last month. The apartment next to that was gutted twice in 1 year. The first time was at the tenant's expense, and the second time, when the landlord realized there was no public record of it, they gutted it again. And they replaced a new stove with a new stove, a new refrigerator with a new refrigerator, and they went market rate. No one is mentioning a big problem here, and that is a failed state agency called the New York State Division of Housing and Community Renewal. They actually provide no supervision over the process of going market rate, and in their MCI decisions, they rubber stamp 90% of all MCI applications. I took my landlord to court. 9 years later, they had to write refund checks for $750,000 to 60 rent-regulated apartments in my building. Alas, 30 had gone market rate. The DHCR did absolutely nothing to step in and see if those apartments needed to be returned to rent regulation. 90% of all MCI increases are rubber stamped. The DHCR is failing completely to do its job, and there is no reason to assume that there's anything atypical about my building.
Thank you for sharing your testimony, Ms. McAteer. Lisa Bradshaw, James Jones, Reno Piantaza, and then Jessica Dinabari.
Hello, I'm Lisa Bradshaw, and this is my brother Timothy. Our mother owns and lives in a three-story building on the Upper East Side in Manhattan, the same where I was born, in the building. 2 blocks from the mayor's mansion. It has 3 rent-stabilized tenants and 1 market-rate tenant. My mother is now 96 years old, housebound, and with an income of $30,000, including what comes from this building. She spends her old age in poverty. She gets Meals on Wheels to help her live. Her rent-stabilized tenants are allowed to earn up to $200,000 and stay there, subsidized by the city rules. The reduction from market rent that these 3 tenants get costs my mother more than she takes in each year. Meanwhile, the tenants are allowed to earn 800% of her entire income, including her Social Security and the Army check she gets from my father having served in World War II. They bought this house soon after he was demobilized. In 1946. Her 3 rent-stabilized tenants have been able to buy summer houses, each one. One has 2 houses on the Cape in Dennis, Mass., 1 in Southold, Long Island, 1 in Lyme, Connecticut. These are houses that cost $200,000 to $300,000. One could be $800,000. The rent stabilization rule claims to allow poorer folk to stay in the city. What it allows is comfortable professionals to buy country homes while the landlord exists, barely surviving. These are college graduates, some with advanced degrees. If the city administrators think they are encouraging business in New York by rent stabilization, consider that these people are actually out of the city almost half the year. And they get around the rules. Those are not their primary residents.
If you could summarize and then
yes,
leave your testimony.
Our expenses rise enormously. Once my mother couldn't afford the Con Ed bill, it was almost turned off. Virtually half our MCI increases have been denied. I looked into hardship relief for running the building. I found that because her expenses eat up 97% of the income, she doesn't qualify for hardship relief. Yes, the real estate has risen, but if the city doesn't let us maintain the building, it's going to be demolished and sold as the others. For real estate, it's going to be gutted, and where will these tenants be? They won't have a place in the city. We think we've earned more consideration from the city for 68 years of property ownership.
Thank you, Ms. Bradshaw. I'd like to leave your testimony. James Jones, Reno Piantaza.
The synagogue of Anka Hesed faces this location. Anka Hesed was sold to the Roman Catholic Church in 1945. The Baptist congregation is now in possession of this building. The logistics of the situation or problem at this location arose where Esther Sheckman, Caucasian white woman developer, also known as Mulberry Associate, purchased the block lot from Andonis Morpheus. What was? Sheckman white woman crashed a resident monthly meeting chaired by a black woman church leader, etc. Sheckman white woman developer ordered all residents assemble out of the lobby. Sheckman white woman developer, unintroduced, unannounced, was confronted or contested by the black woman, chairperson or chairwoman behind the speaker's rostrum, snatching the microphone back from Sheckman white woman developer. Black woman, chairwoman, residents group politely elbowed or pushed Sheckman white woman developer out of the lobby down a small flight of stairs. Sheckman white woman developer was not injured, never taken off her feet. However, Sheckman white woman developer sold the block lot the following business week. However, sold to her Negro porter. There, the Negro porter became a developer. The Corporation Council, New York City Government, 100 Church, advised all residents that this Negro porter developer had been caught or detained pocketing, embezzling $200,000 New York City money.
Mr. Jones, if you would like to leave your testimony with the transcriber, thank you so much. Reno Piantaza, Jessica DeBari, on behalf of Congressman Naylor, Athanasia Lambros.
Good afternoon.
Let's all please respect everyone in the audience. Thank you so much. Ma'am, I think we're all better off if we agree that we should respect each other. That's crucially important to this process. I agree with you, and Ma'am, I think we all agree that we should respect each other. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I understand that being chosen to sit on the Rent Guidelines Board reflects the Mayor's belief that the panel before me is comprised of educated individuals with independent thought, a strong understanding of economics, and a willingness to be fair. 3 years ago, my uncle asked if I would like to invest and help him manage 2 small rent-stabilized buildings in Brooklyn. From the outside, it's easy to do the math and times the number of apartments by the annual rent minus my perceived idea of expenses to come up with an estimate of profit. After being in the trenches for 3 years, I realized I was naive. In 2012, Hurricane Sandy flooded one of our buildings and we lost 2 years of income. We weren't in a flood zone and didn't have flood insurance. In 2013, a brutally cold winter that we all suffered through, combined with high fuel prices, resulted in over 35% of our gross revenue being spent on oil. We broke even that year. In 2014, to avoid a third year of high oil prices, we converted the boiler to gas. The investment depleted most of our cash flow. This year, one tenant with disabilities decided to stop paying rent, and another was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. His choice was to pay for medicine over rent, and how could we blame him? We chose to let him stay in the apartment. This year, we also renovated 2 of our apartments with little possibility of recouping our investment. 2016, that is yet to be determined. Yet something will occur. They always do, and they're not factored for. Thousands of small property owners throughout the city have increasingly necessary and unexpected expenses that must be made to our buildings as they age. That is why I am baffled as I stand here before the board asking for a mere 2% increase. Our buildings cannot survive without proper maintenance, and we cannot provide the housing that our tenants deserve without the reasonable rent increases. I understand this as I myself live in a 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. Thank you.
Thank you. Jessica DeBari on behalf of Congressman Naylor.
Thanks. I'm testifying on behalf of the congressman who can't be here in person today. Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this public hearing before the Rent Guidelines Board. I am here today representing my constituents in the 10th Congressional District, which includes parts of Manhattan and Brooklyn. A great many of my constituents reside in rent-stabilized apartments, and rent regulation is a critical issue of concern for these residents. On April 29th, this board proposed increases for rent-stabilized apartments of 0% to 2% for one-year leases and 0.5% to 3.5% for two-year leases. I urge you to take this opportunity during the final voting process to enact a rent freeze for the first time since this board was established. Last year, the board took a step in the right direction by enacting the low rent hikes in its history. At a time when a majority of rent-regulated tenants continue to struggle financially while landlords are experiencing low increases in operating costs and sustained income growth, a vote of no rent increase is more than appropriate. The Rent Guidelines Board has historically looked at the price index of operating costs, which gauges changes in the operating and maintenance costs of stabilized buildings for landlords to determine a commensurate rent increase. The RGB staff found that the PIAC for all rent-stabilized apartments increased by only 0.5% last year, the lowest such rent increase since 2002. At the same time, the income and expense study states that rental income increased by 4.55% and net operating incomes grew by 3.4%, revealing a prosperous economic climate for landlords. This year marks the 9th year in a row that landlords' net operating income has increased. It's clear that landlords can afford and will still profit from rents remaining constant. While landlords have experienced sustained profits, tenants have continued to struggle, even as New York City's economy overall has seen improvement. According to the most recent housing vacancy survey, from 2011 to 2014, median rents for rent-stabilized tenants rose by 11.9%, while income rose by only 5%. And rent-stabilized tenants are currently facing the highest financial burden of all renters, with a median gross rent-to-income ratio of 36.4%. On behalf of my constituents in the 10th Congressional District and rent-regulated tenants across the city, I again urge you to enact a rent freeze. Passing unwarranted additional financial burdens onto tenants, many of whom are still reeling from prior increases, would be an unfair and unnecessary hardship. A rent freeze will positively impact the lives of millions of New Yorkers and perhaps lighten their growing financial burdens. The lack of decent, affordable housing to new low-income households remains a pervasive issue across New York City. I will continue to fight in Congress for funding of housing programs which directly benefit tenants, and I ask the RGB to consider its unique position in establishing rent adjustments for rent-stabilized tenants and keep our stabilized housing stock affordable for low- and middle-income New Yorkers.
Thank you so much. Anastasia Lambros, Charles Anderson for Assembly Member Deborah Glick, and then Hal Brill.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to address all of you. I am a small building landlord. I have 12 units, 12 apartments, all rent stabilized, so I don't rely on market anything. Okay. I want all of you to know that it is a struggle, especially when you have an older building. My building is over 100 years old. So you can talk about saving of fuel. I saved $1,100 over last year. In the city, there's going to be another issue, which I guess I'm one of the first to address. The city is building all these incredibly expensive high-rise apartments, offering 20% at affordable rents that are not that affordable. One of those projects is next door to my little 5-story, 100-plus-year-old building. We talk about costs that we don't anticipate. I did not anticipate a 32-story building next to my building. For the safety of the tenants, I invested in repointing my building, shoring and bracing my building because of a 32-story complex. I was told if I didn't do that, my building very well might have collapsed, at which point I probably could have made a fortune if my building collapsed. But I chose not to. I chose to get loans. I chose whatever I had to protect the building and to protect the safety of my tenants. 100-plus-year-old housing needs new furnaces, needs new roofs, needs new maintenance, plumbing charges go up, electrical charges go up. So all I'm saying is, yes, there are unscrupulous landlords. And yes, they're unscrupulous tenants. On the other hand, we can't say that anybody in this room is a bad tenant, and I don't think anybody in this room is a bad landlord. So let's forget about the bad, because the majority is good. Now, I realize, first of all, I am not a millionaire, and I realize that we have middle-class affordable housing that's needed, that we're not going to get from these high-rise apartments. However, I have a suggestion. The tenants have hardships, so do we. So why doesn't our mayor and our governor, as they're giving tax abatements to not-so-affordable housing developers, give landlords like myself a tax abatement, because I continue to supply affordable housing to the community. And I will continue to supply affordable housing, because my building's in Chelsea, and I don't want Chelsea to be a series of skyscrapers with Rain Reeds and Whole Foods and banks, so that there won't be any neighborhoods in Manhattan, which is the city that I love.
Sorry, wait, hold on, come on back.
Ms. Lambros, I think you have support from both sides.
Excuse me?
I said I think you have support from the whole audience. Question for you?
Yeah, good job. It's rare to ever get support from both sides, so you should feel pretty proud. Quick question, do you pay real estate taxes?
Absolutely.
And how has your real estate taxes gone up or gone down or
In the
stabilized?
last year, my real estate taxes have gone up 5.5%. I'm sorry, my insurance has gone up 5.5%. My real estate taxes have gone up 3.5%. And as I mentioned, my utilities, I got $1,000, $1,100. So I don't have market apartments. I'm very lucky. I have wonderful tenants. Don't get me wrong, we have an outstanding relationship because we work together. Sometimes they have to wait for me to get something fixed. But you know what? They understand. Not every tenant might understand in the universe, but I'm very fortunate because I work with my tenants. So I don't see why, since I have 100% rent stabilized, that I get penalized for doing the right thing.
Thank you.